Hello, fans of the NPL, and welcome back for another week of the NPL Minors Season 4 Power Rankings, this time for Week 2. I am your host, Richard, and I am not alone. I am joined once more by my wonderful co-host, Noah, aka No Pun Intended. What's up, dude?
I am doing very, very well. It's a pretty busy week, honestly, and it's a week where there's a lot of sort of conflicting opinions as to how the minors division did. A lot of teams necessarily moving around, not necessarily because they did any better or any worse, but because there's other teams that are moving. So it's a pretty difficult week to do the power rankings this week.
Yeah, definitely. Now, apparently, we were misinformed last week, and we weren't supposed to do a match recap segment, which is why there were no graphics accompanying it. So we'll just be sticking to the power rankings from now on because Trev sucks. Just kidding, Trev. I love you. Please don't fire me.
Love you too, Trev.
But it was by his decree that we should not do a recap, and so that we shall not do. Now, before getting into this week's power rankings, I know you've already mentioned a little bit about it, Noah, but I feel a little bit more confident in my power rankings this week as opposed to last week, where most of the teams could be in almost any position, really, which is kind of to be expected from Week 1, but at least this week I'm confident about my bottom half. My top half is still kind of fluid, and like you said, teams kind of jumped around a bit, but what do you see about your power rankings? How are you feeling about yours at this point?
Well, for me, it's more my middle section, that 5 through 11 spot. I want to put everyone at, like, number 7, but only one team is lucky enough to be number 7 on this list, so instead I just kind of had to stack them kind of to the side, but unfortunately, power rankings don't show that, so we'll see what happens.
Right, yeah. I'd say for me, it's actually, like, 7 is kind of my cutoff point. Like, it's my 7 to 2 that I'm kind of the most iffy about, but
yeah.
I think we can move on now into our power rankings, and this week at number 16, I have the Houston Soul Rockets. You have the Jersey Dwebbles. I'll start off and say that for the Houston Soul Rockets, not roosting with a Mew against the Montreal's Mega Blastoise was a pretty big choke. Aster did still have a fresh Salamence in the back, but allowing Mew to go down meant that he had one less potential answer for the Salamence and the other things on Aster's team. He played a decent game otherwise. He did get quite a bit unlucky in several instances, and that may have put him on tilt. Despite that, it was a pretty close game, but a loss is still a loss, and thus he remains at my number 16, Noah.
So number 16, I put down the Jersey Dwebbles. Cloud had to forfeit his game against Mew, so he's now 0-2. Obviously, he's got to be pretty busy now in his personal life. And while I do have a good level of respect for him settling those, I don't feel as though it's necessarily fair. I'm ahead of teams who have played their games and who have shown certain things. So that's why I put him at my bottom position. But at number 15, I put down the Houston Soul Rockets, who were in the bottom position prior to this week. Richard, you have the Vancouver Stealth Rocks. I found it kind of interesting that Adam's Victini check was Mega Altaria, and it only had one attack that Victini resisted, but it's not a big deal. That's the kind of thing that Mega Altaria does decently well. His Mew set was very well made. The Calm Mind set was very scary for Aster to do it, so I will give him some credit for that. But unfortunately, he couldn't take advantage of Aster's misplay on the Mew with the Mega Blastoise. Roost could have potentially won the game. He didn't click it, and I suppose he didn't necessarily play for the choke in that instance. He's ranked low more for his non-synergic roster, which I've mentioned has been a problem for him this entire season so far. For sure.
So for the Vancouver Stealth Rocks, Carney is at number 15 for me this week because his win last week was relatively unconvincing, and this week he got 6-0'd, so letting Pangoro go down so early really hurt his chances against Necrozma. I know that Mega Beedrill is not really a switch into Necrozma, but if he was kind of anticipating a story power set, an immediate Beedrill switch in might have helped him to start getting off some damage before it got fully set up. To answer the question he posed in his video, no, I don't think that Stat Pass needs to be banned. I just don't think that he had enough answers for Necrozma this week. It perplexes me that Carney saw Jar sweep Aster with a Calm Mind Comfy last week, yet he didn't bring any phasing or stat reset moves in case of similar situation this week. But we're going to move on now to our number 14s. I have the Portland Trailblazers, you have the San Francisco Arcaniners. I really don't have much to say about the Portland Trailblazers. They got a forfeit win over the Jersey Dwebbles, so I couldn't really move him up or down despite being 2-0, so he'll stay at my 14 for this week. Noah.
So at 14, I put down the San Francisco Arcaniners. This game was kind of a lesson as to why Hippowdon can't necessarily be a switch into everything, because eventually it just cedes so much momentum to your opponent. George has a bit of a problem with setup mods because both the Latios and the Thundurus gave him fits in this game, and he could have potentially gotten 6-0'd by the Latios if he hadn't gotten a crit with his Sylveon. Sucker Punch Galvantula was a good idea, but unfortunately it's just a bit too niche to be much of a game changer in the long run, and it just doesn't seem like that George has the same spark that he did in his previous GBA seasons, where he was a common playoff contender. So going to number 13, I have the Vancouver Stealth Rocks, you have the San Francisco Arcaniners that I just talked about. And at the beginning of Jar's video, he mentioned that Carney had an amazing team matchup. And then Carney goes out and 6-0'd by Necrozma. I will say I do agree with him that if I were making a league, I would ban Stat Pass and just make it Dry Baton Pass. But that doesn't excuse him letting go of Pangoro so early, and it stems from not really having a great Thunderous switch on his team. His bulky mons don't have great immediate offensive presence, and that really hurts him. And it's not just against Necrozma that I'm talking about. There's a bit of a common thread between the Arcaniners and the Stealth Rocks. They both drafted teams with a high-priced centerpiece, and then a bunch of middle-tier mons behind it. And the common theme behind those teams, this week at least, is that their switch-ins were very, very limited. Opposing teams are able to identify sets that give those teams lots of problems, and that's the main reason why these teams aren't as successful as some of the other squads in the league. Richard.
Yeah, so George has not uploaded his match as of the time of recording this at least, which is well past the deadline, but we don't have much to go off of here. He got extremely fortunate with the Hyper Voice crit with the Sylveon against the Mega Latios, otherwise it might have just swept through his whole team and 6-0'd from the get-go, like you were saying, Noah. To be fair to George, he did play out the rest of the game pretty well from that point on, but he lost most of the 50-50s and the predictions in the late game. He almost got super lucky again at the end, but the game ultimately ended up in a 2-0 loss for the Arcaniners. Moving on to our number 12 teams though, I have the Rosa Radenborg, you have the Portland Trailblazers. For the Rosa Radenborg, you can tell how much Dan prepped for this game, and even if you didn't take his word for it in his commentary, you could see from the match that he just had a good idea of what he was up against and how difficult it would be. Provided he did get quite a bit of hacks in his favor, surviving the Thunderbolt from the Clawitzer's Latios on 1 HP with the Celesteela due to presumably a very low roll, the Clawitzer's Entei missing a Sacred Fire on the Nidoqueen, allowing it to get off a big chunk of damage on the Entei, and getting a crit with the Azel's Flamethrower against the Clawitzer's Excadrill, which probably didn't matter, but still. That is not to take anything away from Dan, though. He played a very solid game and prepped as well as he could, and it paid off in a victory against a highly rated team. Noah.
So number 12, I put the Portland Trailblazers. Like you, I didn't move them my positions because he didn't play his game. Even though he's technically 2-0, it's not a comfortable 2-0 because one game was based off a 50-50 and the other one was a forfeit. So for number 11, I have Rosa Radenborg and you have FC Poplio. Dan's match versus Tone was a very back and forth affair. I did like his Stealth Rock play against the Nidoqueen, a good way to prevent Scolipede from coming back in. However, in that endgame, he got very lucky that Tone's Entei missed the Sacred Fire. To his credit, he did play the endgame extremely well to clinch the win in the end, and I do kind of want to move him up for that, but I can't find another team to move down to compensate for that. Richard.
So for the FC Poplio, now, the real reason that this team is down so far from where they were for me, I'm going to be honest, is because I did my rankings this week without first watching all of the matches, and this was one of the few that I had not yet watched. You see, on the dock, under the Week 2 schedule, the matchup is listed as Oklahoma City versus Tennessee with FCP in parentheses. This, I assumed, was meant to indicate that this was the week when the team transfer occurred, as, for those of you who don't know, Magic has been promoted to play in the NPL Majors, and he will be replaced in the minors by the Tennessee Dynamos. As such, I thought that I had a good excuse to sort of reset the team in the power rankings to better accommodate the rest of the teams in my top half. However, when I went to watch the video, I noticed that Magic and the FC Poplio were still the ones playing this match, but I had already sort of locked in my rankings, so yeah, I'm just going to blame Travis for that one as well. As for the match itself, I think the big thing in this match is that Magic expected and prepped for a hyper-offensive matchup, only to be met by a disgustingly bulky team. It happens, but missing 2 Stone Edges in a row in the first 2 turns really sucked for the FC Poplio and ended up influencing the late game quite a bit. He did have some possible ways to claw the game back, but it was very difficult and relied on him being extremely lucky, which almost happened, but it didn't quite pan out, and Mio was just able to secure the win. Given the circumstances, I definitely don't think I should have dropped this team this low, but like I said, that decision was primarily influenced by me being under the impression that it was a totally different team that had played this week, but oh well. Good luck in the majors, David, and we can move on to our number 10 teams. At number 10, I have the Jersey Dwebbles, you have the Montreal Habsols. So, for the Jersey Dwebbles, I generally don't like moving teams down due to losses by forfeit, as there wasn't really a battle for them to lose, and I think that the actual battles and the results on a cumulative week-by-week basis are the biggest factors in these power rankings. However, with the doubles now being 0-2, and with so many teams that were formerly below them starting to hit their stride and proving that they're worthy of advancing through the rankings, I had no choice but to drop the doubles a bit this week. Noah.
So number 10, I put the Montreal Habsols. I was impressed by Aster's play this week. He was Cobalion well to taunt Adam's bulky mons and prevent the recovery. That is, until he got static parried by the Electabuzz. He didn't catch, but the Mew was faster than Mecha Blastoise, and he assumed that Adam's Nihilego was scarfed in the game, but those few missed reads don't overshadow the fact that he played a very good game, and he had some very cool sets. Cobalion shows why, even though it's not his flying resist, it's a very effective mon in League format, but much like Dan, I'm not sure what other teams I would put below him at this point. So at number 9, both Richard and I had the Colorado Avalugs. I thought Charizard X for Keegan was a great win condition, and wearing down the Donphan check with Toxic Mandibuzz was an effective strategy. I think his team is at its best when it's able to deal consistent offensive pressure, and that's what he did in this game. There's 2 games thus far, and still no sign of Shuckle or Chansey. I'm waiting, Keegan. I need you to show me that these mons can be good. But his team is also generally at its best when he gets 4 metric tons of hacks. The high jump pick miss from Mega Lopunny, not getting para hacks when Keldeo was in on Zapdos, and Frostlass missing a Thunder Wave on Charizard X. Because I feel as though he would have lost his game to Parker without many of that stuff happening, I ultimately moved him down in spite of the fact that he won. Richard.
So I was going to point out that this was a great game because neither Chansey nor Shuckle were brought. He did get a bit lucky with most of the instances of hacks in this game falling in his favor, but the game otherwise was pretty solid. The fact that he got a win this week, as influenced by hacks as it may have been, still gave me a good reason to move him up closer to where I think he should have been given his performances with these last 2 weeks combined. But we can move on to our number 8 teams, which we both have the same once more, the Bullet Punch Club. Uzi this week, he seemed to be thrown off by Rotterdam's team composition and prep. Burning the Dragonite Z-move on the Staraptor's weakened Tyranitar was, well, a good play on the Staraptor's part, but Uzi definitely could have preserved it and played it more carefully with the Dragonite at that point. On top of burning his Z-move, he also potentially wasted a few mons by letting them go down when he maybe should have preserved them and sent in other things. Misplaying at the end with his Dragonite and Jirachi gave the Staraptors an opening to pull the game back, but even so, it was still a very close loss and a well-fought match by Uzi. I just had to move him down a bit for it. Noah.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with everything you said about Uzi right here. Now, it's interesting that Freeze in week 1, I mentioned that when he was in this spot is because he made a bunch of misplays in the mid-game, and Uzi kind of copied Freeze this week in his game against him by making quite a few big misplays. I felt in the mid-game he played a bit too aggressively, losing to Mega Diancie to Lickilicky's Iron Tail, and then he was kind of forced into a position where he had to sack one Mon to kill another Mon at some point. And yeah, the same misplays that you mentioned earlier, I generally agree with. That's pretty much why I moved him down those 4 spots. But at number 7, I have the Rotterdam Staraptors. You put the Anaheim Altarias here. If we ever authorize a best budget Pokemon award in the NPL Minors, I think Lickilicky would have to be the front runner after 2 weeks. What Freeze has done with Lickilicky in this game is so impressive. The Lickilicky was able to outlast the Jirachi and the Dragonite and was able to force Uzi to make switches to Mons that he didn't want worn down. I really don't have much to complain about from Freeze this week. He cut down on the mistakes he made week 1. He played solidly the whole time, and I said I'd move him up if he did. And technically I did, but again, too much competition at the top for me to put him any higher than 7. Richard.
So going on to the Anaheim Altarias, losing Mega Latios at the first couple of turns to a Hyper Voice crit was really unfortunate and put the Altarias on a little bit of the back foot. However, he kept his cool and he played his game from that point on almost immaculately, getting a lot of the predictions and 50-50s correct in the late game and keeping George on his toes. He almost was the recipient of another crucial piece of hacks when he missed his Power Whip with Tangrowth against a Mega Sceptile as it squished in, but luckily justice prevailed and the Altarias were rewarded with a bit of return hacks, getting a Hidden Power Ice crit on the Sceptile the following turn, and then managed to preserve a bit of differential with the prediction on the Arcaniner's Manaphy, sealing the game up for a 2-0 victory. But moving on to our number 6 teams, I have the Oklahoma City Thunderous, you have the Oklahoma City Thunderous, and Mio just seemed to catch the FC Popplio off guard, both in prep and in play this week. Some early game hacks gave Oklahoma City the edge, putting the FC Popplio a bit on tilt, and then enabling him to be a bit more secure in making those risky plays that threw off the FC Popplio even more, giving him a slightly smoother path to victory. Noah.
So I also had the Oklahoma City Thunderous. I'll say this, Mio got pretty lucky in the game. He got bailed out by Magic missing 2 Stone Edges with Garchomp. The series between turns 10 and 13 was rather cringeworthy because he allowed his Zygarde to get Trick Spexed by the Rotom, and then he let both his Tornteat and the Zygarde get burned. I think he kept Kogo around for too long as well, and he pretty much admitted this in his match. I don't know why he necessarily put Toxic on literally everything on his team to necessarily handle a team like Magic's that relies on gathering momentum. But I generally think that his team is just so well composed that it pretty much won him the game from right there. And the fact that he was up 6-3 pretty late in the match is a testament to how well this team synergized together. So at number 5, I put the Chicago Kyurem Blackhawks. Richard, you had the Montreal Habsols. First off, Jar, those video dimensions, man. All that white space. I guess that's meant to represent the canvas, which Jar has masterfully turned this team that we both personally disliked in post-draft power rankings. And he's made it the best team in the league in terms of differential and record. And even more impressive, he made Necrozma actually look good for once, pulling off a 6-0 sweep. I really felt that the the sort of words that he said before and after the match were very telling in the strategy, in that he couldn't find a way to make Metagem work in its normal set, which is offensive, so he turned it into something that could work. And I think with that kind of strategy, it's going to lead to Jar maybe pushing up these rankings even more if he can just keep pulling off these wins. I think that's good advice for any team that's doing a draft league. Richard.
So, getting to the Montreal Habsels, what I saw in this game was kind of a repeat of Aster's problem last week against Jar, where he was too unwilling to predict the Heatran switch-ins and go for a close combat with Cobalion. This week, though, it was his unwillingness to go for Toxic with the Weezing onto the Mew switch-ins, when it was very obvious that Adam was consistently switching out his Skarmory versus the Weezing into his dedicated answer in Mew. Aster ended up under-predicting on one of those switch-ins and burned the Mew with a Will-O-Wisp rather than getting off a Toxic. The burn on the Mew ended up not coming into play too heavily in the grand scheme of things, even though it could have. Luckily for Aster, though, and his commentary sort of suggested that it was a matter of hindsight, which is fair enough. But I don't want to see this become a repeated pattern for the Habsels, as it's very dangerous to give your future opponents the idea that you're always going to make the safe play, and if he just doesn't want to risk making over predictions, then he really has to find some sort of a better middle ground play that doesn't lose him momentum. But he did win, it was a solid match, and with so much turbulence in my top half ranks, it was enough to get him moved up. But we can move on now to our number 4 teams. I have the Chicago Kyurem Blackhawks, you have the FC Poplio. I definitely agree with what you said earlier about the Kyurem Blackhawks. Again, what more is there to say than 6-0 sweep? Jar pulled off another sweep this week. This time it was a bulk-up baton pass Mega Medicham into a Calm Mind Rock Polish Stored Power Necrozma sweep, but a sweep nonetheless. It was very good prep and playing on Jar's part. He saw that he had an unfavorable matchup and he prepped extremely well for it, and he executed perfectly. He saw that the only thing truly standing between Necrozma and a sweep was a Pangoro, which he baited and crippled on the first turn with Heatran, then removed the Pangoro from the equation not long after, leaving the way clear for an attempt at the sweep, which paid off immensely. Noah.
So at number 4, I had FC Poplio. The fact that Magic brought this to a 1-0 loss, considering the early deficit he got with the 2 Stone Edge misses, is rather commendable. He was kind of a victim of Neo's more unconventional sets, and an unfortunate crit at the end of the game, which took out the Tornadus before he was able to attempt to put up Trick Room with the Mega Gallade, risking a miss with the Hurricane. Ultimately, I felt as though the Magic couldn't get a read on Neo's plays, and it seems like his sets sort of prepared for the optimal Smogon-based sets rather than more league-oriented sets, but overall I thought he played pretty well considering that early deficit. He had some nice set ideas like Red Card, Healing Wish, Audino, so I didn't think he played badly enough to move him down that much. But let's go on to number 3, where we both had the main Red Claw Whiskers in this position. I felt Tone played a very even match with Daniki, and what this game came down to for me was the really huge miss from Entei's Sacred Fire, which forced it to take additional damage from the Nidoqueen and compromised its defensive integrity. In this highly offensive game where Tone couldn't find much of an opportunity to recover his health, that one turn of hacks can swing the momentum of the match hugely, but I still think he played really well overall, and I couldn't move him down too much in spite of his loss. Richard.
Yeah, so it was really hard to critique either side in this game. There were very few misplays on the part of both teams. Perhaps Clawitzer Scolipede setting up with a substitute on the Nidoqueen, which was packing Roar, might count a little bit, as he hadn't really scouted out the Nidoqueen set up to that point, but hindsight. I think, like you were saying, the deciding factor in this game was hacks. Partially the low roll with the Thunderbolt against the Celesteal in the beginning, but more so with the Entei missing Sacred Fire on the Rosa Raidenborg's Nidoqueen, which basically resulted in the Clawitzers losing a massive win condition, so I felt like I couldn't really move him down too much for this loss. But moving into our number 2 teams, I have the North Carolina Tyranitar Heels, you have the Anaheim Altarias. For the Tyranitar Heels, there was a lot of influential hacks this week, as we've mentioned before, and the Tyranitar Heels were not exempt from it. The disasters began when Megalopony missed the high jump kick on the Evolug's Keldeo, thus getting taken out by the Keldeo's Secret Sword. Parker then makes a series of misplays as a result, kind of playing a bit on tilt. He then misses a Thunder Wave with the Frostlass on the Mega Charizard X as it sets up a Dragon Dance later in the game, which may or may not have made a difference in the overall result, but it put Parker in more of a position to lose, although the result was very close and dependent on hacks. Noah.
So number 2, I put the Anaheim Altaria as it's the highest that either of us have ranked a 2-0 team in the power rankings, which just goes to show that record doesn't mean everything. I felt like Noah could have won immediately without George's Sylveon critting his Mega Latios. He made a great read with the Thunderous Therian on the Hippowdon switch in, going for Nasty Plot and pretty much assuring himself a kill. Then he swapped Thunderous in on Manaphy, predicting a Tail-O, and got that exactly right as well. It shows that he's playing like 2 or 3 turns ahead whenever he goes with it. It always just seemed like he was one step ahead of George during that game with his plays. Like he kind of got into George's head. And of course that's difficult to say because George didn't upload his side, but thinking ahead is a skill that grants coaches success in the long run. And in this league, I think it's a very important skill to have, and that's why I have him so high here. But at number 1, I put the North Carolina Tyranitar Heels. You have the Rotterdam Staraptors at the top position. Parker was the victim of repeated unlucky rolls in this game, as you mentioned, Lopunny missing high jump kick on the Keldeo, and the Frostlass missing Thunder Wave on the Charizard X. I talked about Zapdos and Donphan being a very strong defensive core back in week 1, but he let his Donphan get tossed early on by Aerodactyl, and it made him falter later on in the game against Dactyl and Zard X. But I think it's tough to really move him because even considering all the hacks that went against him, he still came very close to winning, and he was able to bring the match down to 1-0 in spite of that hacks. Richard.
So at my number 1, the Rotterdam Staraptors. For this game, Lickilicky basically carried the team, putting in some decent work early in the game and then managing to outstall the Bullet Punch Club's Jirachi at the end of the game to bring it down to a matchup against a weakened Dragonite, which was not able to finish off the Lickilicky, thus resulting in a 1-0 victory for the Rotterdam Staraptors. As much as I just absolutely hate Lickilicky, I am happy to see it put in work on the Staraptors team. I'm also happy to see Electrode being a little bit useful in this game as well, and with all of the teams that were formerly above the Staraptors losing this week, I found it fitting to reward them with the number 1 spot in my power rankings. But I think that will conclude our rankings for this week, week 2 of the NPL Minors Season 4. Please remember to add your comments below if you have anything to say, if you have your own rankings, whose rankings you think are more accurate. I know we're kind of moving closer to having more teams in the same common position, but we want to hear your thoughts down below. Noah, thank you once again for joining me. It's been an awesome time. Do you have any last words for the people at home?
Well, I would just like to say that if you're like Richard and you don't notice that one of the games has been played, make sure to check out the National Pokeball League channel where we have playlists for every single week of the NPL Minor Season 4 with videos of every single game from every single side that has posted a match in that particular point. And make sure to also subscribe to the NPL channel for more Power Rankings content and more of a collection of the coaches that play their matches in the league.
And if you're like Trev and you don't make things easy for the people analyzing these games to properly analyze them, then just don't be like Trev. But, with that being said, we'll end the video here, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.